So 5 or 6, right? If you guys go past the minute, I'm this one.
Use that. Oh, I think we're waiting for it.
A little awkward that they designed this boardroom like this. I think back in the day, people really wanted to feel elevated. It feels weird, All right, public note, we're gonna get ahead and start the council meeting at 5:02. Public notice and call of Coachella City Council and Coachella Planning Commission Special City Council Meeting Joint Study Session. Notice is hereby given that the City Council of Coachella and Coachella Planning Commission will holding a joint study session on Wednesday, May 3rd, commencing at 5 p.m. or as soon as thereafter as possible in the City Hall Council Chambers, 1515 6th Street, Coachella, California. Said study session shall be for the purpose of discussing the following item. Discussion and proposed amendments to Title 17, Chapter 17.54, off-street parking and loading. All right, if you would like to attend the meeting via Zoom, here the link is online. You can also join by telephone at +1 669 900 6833. And the webinar and ID and password are there. Public comments may be received either in person, via email, telephonically, or via Zoom with a limit of 250 words or 3 minutes. If participating in real time via Zoom or phone during the public comment period, use the raise hand function on your computer, or when using a phone, participants can raise their hand by pressing *9 on the keypad. Written comments may be submitted to the City Council electronically to cityclerk@coachella.org. Transmittal prior to the start of the meeting is required. All written comments received will be forwarded to City Council and entered into the record. If you wish, you may leave a message at 760-262-6240 before 5:30 p.m. on the day of the meeting. To live stream the meeting, you may be viewed online by accessing the city's website at www.coachella.org and clicking the Watch Council Meetings tab located on the home page, and then clicking on the live button. All right, staff.
Gabriel.
Okay, thank you, council, members of the Planning Commission. So we typically don't have a lot of special study sessions like this between council and Planning Commission, but we are doing some revisions to our zoning code. One particular code revision that we're working on is updates to our parking standards, and that could be a very involved process. And so we want to make sure we get the feedback from the Planning Commission and the City Council in the direction that we're going into. Revising the parking standards could be very important for also encouraging economic development. Just in a review of our parking standards, it looks like we're a lot higher than some of our surrounding cities. And so this is an opportunity for us to be able to right size those standards that could provide more opportunities for business and even some of the existing businesses, right? So we definitely don't want to be in a position where we're over parking some of our commercial centers. So that's what we're going to do today. And we do have our contract planner that is working with the city on this effort. And her name is Stephanie Tomaino from City Advisors. And she will guide the Planning Commission and the City Council for this presentation. So, hi, Stephanie, I'll pass it on to you. And I believe you'll be sharing your screen, correct?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, sure, no problem. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good evening, honorable members of the City Council and Planning Commission. It's wonderful being with you here virtually tonight. I will say that I'm hearing a little bit of an echo in the council chamber, so I'll try my best to get through the presentation without the echo being too distracting. Okay, so as Gabriel mentioned, last December, the City Council initiated a zoning ordinance amendment. The goals were to modernize the municipal code, allow for greater flexibility in development standards, and improve the aesthetics of commercial centers. Updating the parking chapter of the code is a very important piece to accomplishing those goals. Overall, the current parking code is outdated and difficult to use for both staff and applicants. Our goal of the parking code update is to make sure the regulations reflect the community's vision and economic development priorities. We want to be competitive with other cities in the Coachella Valley, and we want to address ambiguities, allow for more flexibility, and plan for the future. So first, we want to ask the question of where Coachella stands in comparison to all of the other cities in the Valley. So to understand this, we ran a comparison of several different land uses. We looked at hypothetical examples of different kinds of retail and restaurant uses. So let's first look at a conventional retail store. This ruler shows how Coachella measures up against other cities. For this land use type, Coachella is right in the middle, and most cities are in the same boat. They use a very similar parking ratio for retail uses. And when you apply that parking ratio to a hypothetical business, such as this 1,000 square foot clothing store, you'll see that once again, Coachella is right in the middle. Now, this ruler has an inverse effect. The lower the parking ratio, the more parking spaces the city requires. So when you go backwards, you'll see that Indio is at the very top of this list. But then when it translates over to the number of parking spaces required, you'll see it's at the bottom. So when you reduce the number of parking, or when you reduce the parking ratio number, this equates to a higher parking requirement. So now let's take a look at a different type of retail use, such as a big box retail like Target. The parking ratio is the same in Coachella, 1 space per 250 square feet. However, some cities have different standards for big box retail stores, and other cities have different standards for large commercial shopping centers. Which is why when you apply the parking ratios to this retail store, Coachella now comes at the bottom of this list, meaning that Coachella requires more parking than most other cities in the Valley. And now let's switch gears and look at restaurant uses. Parking ratios across the Valley are a bit more mixed, and each city has a slightly different standard. However, you'll see that Coachella is at the top of this list. So what this means is because the ruler has an inverse effect, Coachella now appears at the bottom of this list, meaning that the city requires the most parking for this hypothetical restaurant. You'll also see that Coachella requires the most parking for restaurant uses, but it also requires significantly more parking compared to other cities using this hypothetical example. And in our last example, we'll look at a specific type of restaurant, fast food and takeout, such as a coffee shop. Some cities, which are highlighted here in red, have different parking ratios for smaller restaurant uses. Once again, you'll see that Coachella is at the top of the list. So when you take that parking ratio and apply it to this hypothetical coffee shop, you'll see that it's now at the bottom, meaning that the city has the most restrictive parking requirement. A small 1,000 square foot coffee shop would be required to provide close to 20 parking spaces, which would be very difficult to comply with. So these high parking mandates, it could potentially deter new businesses and stifle economic growth and commercial revitalization. Now that we've looked at a couple of hypothetical examples of different businesses, let's look at an actual case study. Here is a picture of El Paseo Square, a commercial shopping center in Palm Desert. This is the Google Street View image taken in 2011. And just from the Street View, you can see it's not very inviting. The buildings are extremely far set back. There's not really a whole lot going from the road. But now here it is today. You'll see that 10 years later, the biggest change here is that there's a new restaurant building visible from the street. So if you're driving by, you can easily see from the road that there's places to eat in the center, and drivers may want to stop by and see what else this center has to offer. So just flipping back, this is what it looked like in 2011. And then this is what it looks like today. So the best part of this case study is that the center really takes advantage of underutilized parking spaces. You'll see from this aerial image that there are a lot of parking spaces without cars using them. Again, you'll see that the buildings are very far set back from the road, so there's not really much to pull drivers in. So fast forwarding to today, you'll see that they built a building over here, as well as a building over here, much closer to the road. And it's really amazing how these smaller buildings became the catalyst for renovating the entire center and giving it a completely new look and feel. But one thing that hasn't changed over the 10 years is that there are still plenty of unused parking spaces. Which now brings us to the purpose of today's joint study session. Staff needs your input on how much the parking code should be changed. But since this study session is all about parking, let me rephrase our question to instead ask, how far do we really want to go? We have 5 different levels of changes, starting with moderate changes, rising up to substantial changes, and finally to the top level, which would be considered paradigm shifting. So we've categorized that into 5 different levels, 1 being moderate, all the way up to 5, which is the most radical changes. Staff reviewed parking regulations from surrounding cities in the Valley, and we also looked at various parking programs from cities throughout Southern California. And through our research, we generated a list of 12 different parking options to consider, and we are seeking your input on which options should ultimately be incorporated into this ordinance. We'll briefly go over each parking option in the following slides. But since we only have 1 hour dedicated to the study session, we really wanted to make this discussion as clear and easy as possible. So we combined the last 2 slides and we assigned each parking menu option into one of the 5 categories. So if, for example, you are only comfortable making moderate changes to the zoning code, then your vote would be to implement 3 of these programs which fall under the level 1 category. And then one last thing I do want to mention is that if you vote for a level 5 paradigm shift, what that means would be eliminating parking minimums altogether. This would ultimately result in removing nearly all the parking regulations, and these other new programs would no longer be pursued. So the first menu option, it entails really simple yet important user-friendly changes to make the code easier to understand and follow. So for example, the current zoning code does not have a parking table. So when you're looking through it, just from a staff standpoint and even an applicant standpoint, it's really difficult to be able to find the parking requirements that apply to you. So it's pretty standard practice that all other cities have use a parking table, which is much easier to follow. The second menu option focuses on adding new parking standards for uses that are already permitted by right in the code. So for example, these 3 uses that are listed in the table, they're already allowed in the city, but they do not have a specific parking ratio applied. Instead, staff assigns them a generic parking, commercial parking ratio and kind of treats them in the same boat, even though they are clearly very different uses. So the goal of this program would really be to find parking ratios that are most appropriate to these uses. And the final parking menu option in our level 1 category would be creating new parking ratios for uses not already addressed in the code. So for example, this list represents business types that have gained significant popularity in recent years. And oftentimes staff has to apply a parking standard to this use that doesn't necessarily fit. So moving on, we are going to now look at level 2 menu options. This program would reduce parking requirements for existing uses already permitted in the city. So as pointed out earlier, we would compare Coachella against other cities in the Valley, and we would adjust parking ratios as needed. The goal here is to make sure that we're not the most restrictive city. We've already looked at parking ratios for retail and restaurant uses, but we feel that there is additional opportunity to improve our parking requirements for warehouse and industrial uses. This option would allow large multi-tenant shopping centers to be parked at a uniform ratio. So currently, parking requirements for a center are calculated by looking at the individual tenants. So looking at this example on the left-hand side, we would look at 4 tenants in the center, determine how many spaces are required per tenant, and then we would add it up to get the total parking requirement for the center. Overall, this can be very tedious to administer from both the business and city staff side, and it requires a lot of time to maintain the tenant list and recalculate parking each time. So this program would simplify all of that, and we would allow larger tenants to use a uniform parking ratio regardless of their tenant mix. And overall, the goal here is to reduce parking requirements for larger properties. And the last menu option under level 2 would allow applicants to propose alternative standards for unique uses. In other words, the applicant may propose a different parking standard rather than having to comply with the parking requirements of a different business type, which could potentially operate very differently. This option would establish review criteria such as requiring a parking study, and we are recommending allowing some parking studies to be reviewed by the director to streamline the overall process. Now, I want to reiterate the importance of creating flexibility in our regulations so that we do not force businesses to fit within a box, which could potentially constrain business innovation or creativity. So ask yourself this: How would you park this business? It's called Meow Wolf. It's has a couple of locations, including this one in Santa Fe. I would highly recommend checking it out. It's kind of like an art museum / an entertainment center and an event venue all rolled into one. And it's kind of an extreme example of a unique business, but it's just to give you an example that other unique businesses out there could benefit from having parking alternatives that would really just allow for more flexibility. So now we're going to move on to level 3 of our menu options. As a reminder, level 3 represents substantial changes to the code. Applicants could be incentivized to add amenities to their projects in exchange for a parking reduction. These are examples of similar programs in La Quinta and Indio. In these cities, applicants have the option to lower their parking requirements if they increase their landscaping or provide carpool spaces, for example. The proposed program in Coachella would look like this. Staff recommends setting thresholds to allow some requests to be approved administratively through the director. And we also recommend including some criteria to allow staff or to assist staff in evaluating the merits of a project. And then our menu options for programs 8 and 9 are combined on this slide. So just imagine there's a new restaurant in town that wants to lease a space previously used as a retail store. The current code requires a lot more parking for restaurants, so the applicant decides to request shared parking. However, the current process takes at least 3 months to go through, and it requires a conditional use permit and planning commission approval. So with this menu option, staff would create more flexibility to allow this kind of parking request to be reviewed administratively by the director. And our last option under level 3, it's adding provisions to the code to explicitly allow valet parking and vehicle lifts. Vehicle lifts are not currently used in the city, but this is really just an emerging technology that is popping up more in urbanized areas. And so since this parking code could potentially be used for the next 10 or 20 years, it's good to look forward and plan ahead for future parking technologies. So now we're going to move on to level 4. This parking program would remove minimum parking requirements for specific districts or neighborhoods. So when I was researching other cities that have eliminated minimum parking requirements, I did find that most often it occurred in downtown or historic districts, typically in neighborhoods that are meant to be walkable and served by public transit. So this program would really just target specific districts in the city. And here's the last parking menu option that we'll be discussing today. It would allow applicants to request parking reductions without the incentives. So this means that the city would not require improvements. So this means that the city would not require improvements such as additional landscaping or pedestrian amenities. Instead, any applicant requests a parking reduction. So to recap, we are asking all council members and commissioners to provide input on how far we should go with these parking updates. As a reminder, based on our research, we have identified various parking amendments which have been presented today as a menu of parking options, and they are categorized into 5 different levels. Level 1, the level 1 changes would implement 3 parking programs, which are all considered moderate changes to the parking code. Level 2 would add on to that and carry out the programs that fall under both level 1 and 2 categories. Level 3 continues to build on to that. Level 3 includes implementation of 10 different programmatic changes to the city's parking regulations, which altogether represents a substantial change to the zoning code. Level 4 includes the implementation of 11 different parking programs. And the main change here is that the citywide parking reduction program would be implemented, so an incentive-based program would not be needed. And then level 5 represents a complete paradigm shift. This entails eliminating parking minimums throughout the city, which really makes the rest of the parking programs irrelevant. So now what are the pros and cons of eliminating parking minimums? Well, the biggest change or the biggest benefit really is its simplicity. It's easy to understand and it's easy to implement. It could also attract new businesses and property redevelopment, but there are drawbacks as well to consider. So for starters, there are limited examples of other cities with successful implementation. I personally only found one city in all of Southern California that has implemented or that has eliminated parking minimums. That would be Culver City in Los Angeles County. There's also a lot of uncertainty and risk. It could potentially increase traffic. It could result in more illegal parking, and it could attract uses that are inconsistent with the community character. So these are all pros and cons that should be considered. So before wrapping up, I thought it would be helpful to understand how other cities in Coachella Valley compare. So we took this 5-level scale and assigned hypothetical ratings to a few cities. Now, remember, this is a very simplified rating scale that's only used for the purposes of facilitating today's discussion. So in reviewing these 3 cities, I found that they use different combinations of parking programs, so they do not fall neatly into a specific level. Rather, you'll see that La Quinta is now kind of like a level 2.5, and Indio is kind of like a level 3.5. So I've listed here a few parking programs that each of those cities use, which really heavily influence staff's research and recommendations that were presented today. And when considering how far we want to go with these parking changes, it's really about looking to the future and what potential opportunities are we leaving off the table. So here's the Coachella Shopping Center as it appeared in 2012. What is it that we notice first? Perhaps we notice how empty the center kind of looks, the fact that many of the parking spaces are being unused. Fast forward to 10 years later, now what do we see? What changes have you noticed that have taken place over the last 10 years? We do see that the tenants have changed and the palm trees are beginning to grow, but for the most part, the parking lot remains primarily empty. So it really begs the question, does it really make sense to dedicate that much prime real estate to parking cars? Or is there a better use for this parking lot? So how far do we want to go? Staff is requesting feedback from the City Council and Planning Commission tonight. Your comments and direction will assist staff in preparing amendments to the parking chapter of the zoning code. That concludes staff's presentation, and I will open it up for discussion and deliberation.
Any comments? Gabriel, to start the conversation, what are your thoughts? What are your recommendations? Let's instigate dialogue.
Yeah, just in reviewing there's a couple things that Stephanie brought up in her presentation. Our municipal code standards for parking are really outdated, really hard to read. If we were to give it to the community member, it would be hard for them to understand what we require. So I think we need to clean up that. But the other is, how daring do we want to be with our parking standards? And, as a staff member, I think we could be pretty daring and kind of be a little bit more groundbreaking with our parking standards. So you can see like Indio is probably a little bit more daring with their parking standards, but I think to the point where it's going to benefit them in the future, right? They're going to be able to welcome new economic development opportunities. And my understanding, they recently updated their parking standards in the city. I think La Quinta did theirs maybe about 5 years ago for the same reason, to increase economic development. Palm Desert did theirs as well. And so Stephanie gave the example of that one shopping center, the El Paseo Plaza. So, I think we definitely need to improve our standards, right, and reduce them. So, I think we could do more than the level 1 that Stephanie described. It just, mainly we want your feedback, right? So if you want to be that daring, right, we could go all the way to kind of where Indio is, right? If we want to be a little bit more conservative with our parking, then, it's probably around the level of where Rancho Mirage is today.
So I think City of Indio changed theirs, right? Is that way there's a hotel going in the middle where the old North Indio parking lot is that kind of how that hotel kind of happened? So something like that potentially, like you could, for example, we're going to use the Coachella shopping center, right? That could, if we update the code, right, that could potentially bring in a new like a new shopping center addition in there instead of all that parking, because that shopping center is always empty, right? Like,
right.
And anybody that there's no one in there. So how could that, how would that look like though, right? We've got to make sure that we're not, giving up too much and then we end up with all these cars again in that parking lot. We don't have that space again. So
So think about an example. So the example that Stephanie brought up about Palm Desert. So probably Palm Desert at the time thought, hey, we're doing something groundbreaking by reducing our parking standards. And they did it, right? Did the Skyfall in that shopping center is too crowded. It's pretty successful, right?
Yeah.
And so so there's something to say about taking some of those risks, but making sure that they're calculated, right? So I think some of the recommendations that are up there, even if we went to maybe a level 4, I think it'll still work out for the city, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, if you want to be a little bit more like, you know, on the conservative side, maybe staying to number 3, and, you know, with that, reviewing it after, you know, like 5 years and coming back and seeing, can we go to that level 4? Yes.
This question. When is traffic, if we're doing a traffic study, is that taken into consideration into the parking?
Not with the parking updates.
So I'd like to see how much traffic is coming from the south end, right? Because obviously we're trying to accommodate for everybody that crowds into the city of each other, right? So I'd like to see that. What we move forward, right? Is how many people do move to the city, need to park there. Also to, what is our pedestrian really kind of look up here in the city. You know, are people walking to these centers, specifically downtown, right? Right, kind of be walking to downtown. So we are we have from to get there. So obviously the traffic, you don't need a parking lot for the pedestrian paths. So that's something to take into account. And also too, maybe if we consider traffic flow, right? When it comes to downtown, if we're looking specifically to accommodate parking in downtown, perhaps we should look at right one-way streets versus okay, let's we can gain spaces. Probably utilize. That's something. So I think ultimately, if the vision for downtown is to grow on the east side, right, east of 86 or 33 one day, then maybe you just take a leap of faith and just one way is 6th Street go that way. People program.
Excuse me, let me interrupt for 1 second. If you could utilize the microphone so that our Zoom attendants can hear.
And
That was my comment.
If you have to start from the beginning.
Commissioner, I do want to mention that we do have our city engineer, Andrew Simmons,
Yeah.
available too. And, you know, I think as far as thinking about the streets in downtown, you know, I think that's come up as discussion of what that would mean if there were one-way streets. But it's just been a discussion, right? But I think you're right. If, for example, I think Stephanie brought up the example of, you know, if you had no minimum standards in the downtown, right, maybe where it makes sense and you have a good pedestrian network. But it also requires the city to do more, right? So how do we make the pedestrian infrastructure even better than it is today, right? So it really facilitates that. So it does, if we do something like that, it does require more work for the city to work on the infrastructure.
Yeah, perhaps that's something worth pursuing, right? So maybe we fall in the middle of a hybrid model. We create special districts, right? Where we can in downtown just be courageous and go level 5 extreme and just say, hey, we don't have a parking standard, right? Just build it all out. So I'm kind of under these ideas that we build it, they'll come, right? So I'm for reducing parking as much as possible just to build out buildings, right? We've had too many centers on our north end that are pretty much empty, right? Underutilized spaces where you think about, you look at the Smart and Final, it's underutilized. You look at across the street where they showed Ranch, what is the Coachella Ranch Market area or Garibaldi area. It's that underutilized parking spaces. Everybody parks in front of their store, wherever they got to go to, right? So you got maybe 60% of the space is underutilized, right? So in centers like that, where mostly everybody who's going into those centers are probably outside residences, right? So that's something maybe to consider, right? How many actual cars are traveling to these centers? And so we figure out how many parking spaces we really do need. Just to prove it that.
Thank you, Jason.
I have a clarifying question. So I understand that chapter 17 is our, street parking and loading, policy or code. Does this include garage parking? Because I noticed in the chat, we talked about parking in different locations. And so is it also consideration of those zones, residential zones as well?
Yeah, so we'll be looking at residential standards. I know today, most of the presentation today was on commercial standards. So any kind of feedback on residential standards is definitely welcomed, right? So currently today for typical single family residential lot, it does require that you have parking for 2 spaces in a garage and then 2 that would be able to park in the driveway. But that's just single family, and then multifamily is definitely, I forgot what the ratio is, but it's more than 1 per unit.
Can I comment to that? And we take into consideration, how we have now these generational suites are being built when it comes to residential and being built into these new developments. Can we account for an extra parking space? Maybe dedicate a specific area for as well as generational suites that exist in a new home. So if this or the development, if the development has 10 total generational suites that are being built into the development, can we account for 10 additional parking stations or lots somewhere within the development?
Or like a large subdivision that's planned like that?
Yeah.
We can, yeah, and that's been some of the feedback that we've been giving some of the potential developers in the city. That so a lot of them are interested in smaller lot subdivisions, even up to a size of 5,000 square feet. So what we've noticed in some of these, higher density subdivisions is that it doesn't allow for a lot of on-street parking. And so there ends up being that kind of situation. So we do ask for them to be able to plan for that additional parking somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And so it is something that we've noticed that Vista Escondida is as an example.
Yeah, we definitely need to figure out a remedy for that. But we need a balance, right? So obviously, especially we need to really look at types of, what people are doing ultimately as homeowners, right? And the amount of parking spaces really needed. So perhaps like a survey is needed in a lot of communities to really, figure out where we're at today and where we're headed. And figure out our parking solutions for now and in the future.
Thank you, Vice Chair, Dr. Figueroa.
And then, garages are getting converted to homes. Right, and I've seen them in my neighborhood. There's like 3 homes that are turning into garage. So how do you account for that type of parking, right, in the older homes and, since they no longer have that parking, right? So where are all those cars? So like that one household now, instead of having what you were gonna have 3 cars, now it's gonna have 7, right? And so.
Are your neighbors?
Not my neighbors, not my neighbors. Just my neighborhood, I walk my neighborhood and do a walk around and stuff. So I'm just wondering how that'll take an effect in the parking, right? And that's that portion. So.
Yeah, we can take a look at that. If the Planning Commission Council wants, we currently do have like an ordinance that must have been adopted the last 5 years that allows for the garage conversions without having to replace that parking anywhere on the property.
It's a state law, isn't it now, to allow for parks to change into dwelling units?
For the garage conversions, I don't think so, but if it's an accessory dwelling unit,
Yeah.
it is, right? But if it's just a garage conversion to become part of the existing home, then our municipal code allows you to forego parking.
Yeah, so we're going for.
Yeah.
But the amendment, it has both the commercial and yeah, so it has both here, so it's not really off topic. I see if we look at page 3, it talks on the homes. But yeah. I mean, it's something to look further into. Maybe we can separate the conversations, but the home part, we're encouraging ADUs in our city. I think we're working on that. We're not going to create more barriers for them. And it's an issue everywhere, but I guess we'll look at what other cities doing it, because it's not, I mean, the good thing about our city is that we can look at other cities that are a lot more dense and seeing what they're doing in combating this. I mean, the biggest issue here, I think I hear from our neighbors are sometimes when those cars park in front of your mailbox and the USPS doesn't get off to leave off the mail. But aside from that, like, it's not a huge issue, you know. I think we can continue to bring back the conversation on commercial. I'd like to hear more from, I mean, are the council colleagues and planning commissioners that haven't had a chance to speak?
Gabe, so in the section where it says like, how far do we want to go? And there's, 1, 2, 3. There are some of these things on here listed. I mean, we don't have to go exactly for that, right? We could eliminate some. The only concern I have for number 3, I personally think we should go until 3. I think that would be a good starting point, and then also making sure that we are doing, a traffic study and doing everything. Commissioner Hernandez, he brought up a really good point, that there are some things that we have to still look at. For example, in downtown, are we going to make sure that it's more walkable? If so, then we need to make sure that our plans are updated, that we're able to do that here. But for example, on number 3, where it says allow valet and stacked parking to satisfy parking requirements, I'm not a big fan of seeing that in the city. I think that probably invites more vehicles to be around. I don't know if I'm understanding that part right, but preferably I think that would be something I don't think we would need here. I don't know how the council feels about that, but
Instead of stacked, maybe we gotta plan for like parking structure, especially if you're gonna need it one day. So how do you prepare for one, right? How do you properly look at that? But I think the all the other ones except for that one is kind of in that section 3 that I agree with Councilwoman Beatty on that. So.
And so there's gonna be a separate discussion about downtown parking coming to planning commission and then city council very soon.
And so that definitely will be a good opportunity to talk about structured parking, because I've heard more discussion that that's where the need is, right? That's where we experience the high parking demand. Like, I don't anticipate this zoning code would address like the need for a structure, right? A lot of that's going to come from council. If you think there's a need, and for us to start planning for that.
right.
But, as far as valet stack parking, I think Stephanie brought up the example of, we might not have that need today, but you see this more in bigger cities where, they're more built out, right? And there is the need for them to manage their parking better. And so some of the ways that they do that is by allowing valet parking. Right now in our code, we just don't have anything that allows for it today.
Okay.
My apologies for being late. This is something, when I was on the planning commission, this was always an ongoing issue when it comes to parking requirements. And as we started to build out, we realized that a lot of the parking requirements no longer were applicable to what's currently happening today. And one of those big issues came around when the cannabis industry came through, because the cannabis, for example, the hybrids were being compared to the warehouses, and there's more parking spaces that you need to provide than from the hybrid, for the cannabis warehouses. And so this is actually, I think it's pretty clear that our parking policy is very, very dated and needs to be updated. So I'm glad that you're bringing this through. We see, for me, I'm in favor of reducing parking, and that's just been a long stand of mine. We see a lot of the mixed use developments coming through. We're encouraging more carpools. We're encouraging more van use. We're encouraging more transit occupancy. So there's all these different things now that we're promoting to kind of move away from the one vehicle, one person type of, transportation. And I missed obviously most of the discussion in the presentation, but we also see a lot of these commercial sites and malls that, again, are just not working the way they did in the past. You see all these parking spaces that are empty, but you see like out in the Walmart plaza is that you see where Starbucks and McDonald's, it doesn't have the right flow. but yet you have all this additional parking right in front of it that is not in use, and it just doesn't make sense anymore. The way we develop or in the past just doesn't make sense anymore today, and it's easily visible when you have those congestions when it comes to those fast food restaurants. So I definitely think that there should be a reduction also in commercial sites. And I think obviously the developers, I think, want that as well, because they have all this empty spaces and they want to provide more, office space. And we need more office space. We're in need of more office space. And I know that we have these empty offices, but they're large space offices. And the average person doesn't want this huge, empty site. They don't know what to do with the rest of it. And they can't afford the lease on it as well. And so I think that we can become more inventive and creative as how we're using these spaces. And I also noticed, and I know that some of you have mentioned as well, is for some of these commercial sites that their parking spaces are being now used for different things, and they're literally building on it. And so I also understand why, and I support it as well. And then we also have to think of now the commercial online businesses that we have going on. And I'm pretty sure some of you have tapped into it a bit, but in the downtown, these trucks come and there's nowhere for them to pull up. And so they kind of just stop in the middle of the road. And these roads are so narrow as it is. And so I think when we're talking about parking, that we also need to keep in mind that online is where everything is going, and that we're making sure that we're creating these spaces where these, vans or, trucks are able to load and unload. And I know many cities are building that way as well. That's just a must now. So those are some of my comments, and I know it's probably going to go before the Planning Commission again and before council, but I definitely think that those are things that we need to keep in mind as far as where we're going in the commercial industry. And as far as the housing, like some of my colleagues have said, and some of the commissioners, is, the parking, there's always complaints about parking all of the time. But then we also have, you see, as we all know, we have, multiple families within one home. So I agree. We support ADUs. It's now available, but I think that when we're thinking of parking as well, is how do we make it easier so that they can convert their lawn into an additional driveway, not just using or converting the garage, because there already is multiple cars, or a lot of people use their garages as storage. They have a lot of stuff in there. So they're using the driveway and the road for parking. And one thing I get all the time is that there's code requirements when it comes to building these additional driveways on the lawn. And I think that that's, if we're thinking about parking in the housing areas, especially in these dense communities, and the reality is that our entire city is a dense community and we're talking about housing. And so that we're also looking at the code requirements that allows additional parking on their front yard. And how do we do that so that it's aesthetically welcoming? I think that's another thing we can look at.
Thank you, Councilmember Delgado. Commissioner Ramirez, you have some comments?
Yeah, I have one more comment. So it's more of a question and it might be for Gabriel or Stephanie on the line. And that's regarding the commercial space. So for that space, parking spaces, is that city owned or is that completely owned by the retailer? So the anchor retailer or whomever. So are they private or are they public? That's my question. And so we're going to develop on private land, we have to consider, having those expenses also with the owner of them, right? Yeah. I mean, right.
Yeah, so how this would work out, let's say we reduced our standards and we saw some examples of a sea of parking in the commercial center, right? So that's in the municipal code. So if the developer wants to, build a new building on their commercial center, they would apply that new code, right? Now it's incumbent upon us to be able to outreach to them about the opportunity, right? If we don't do that, then they're not going to take advantage of it, right? So we would need to do some outreach if we decided to go in that direction. And so that might have occurred in the other cities, right?
Yeah.
So if they don't know that incentive, then they're probably not going to take advantage of it.
With that said, my follow-up question is, can staff look into that? Just said that if we, as I'm hearing, there's a consensus of a hybrid approach, we may be moving to that third zone for development and for changes and updating our parking structure to look into those as a model or an example. Thank you.
Well, let's hear from the, I know we're cutting it short. Let's hear from the other commissioners and then we'll go back to, I know Commissioner Fonseca, Commissioner Arivu and Commissioner Murillo, just to want to give them an opportunity to say a few words and then we'll come back.
My biggest concern is with,
It's on.
It's on, okay.
There you go.
My biggest concern is with the residential. And a lot of this has already been covered. Constantly, yes, we know parking is always going to be an issue. We have to take into account that families are growing. Also, we have to take into account when we do talk about the commercial space is in any studies that are being conducted, are we taking into account the new families that are going to move into all the new built houses, right? How much more traffic are we going to get into the city now? So it's really thinking about the future when as we're doing this, right? So I would definitely recommend that we do some sort of survey, and when we do that we do make it accessible for the elder community. I was just on the phone with an elderly man for the community here from like 2nd Street earlier, and he also had complaints about the parking and then the code violations, right? Like the fact that they get ticketed and all of this stuff, right? And it's just part of that. The same thing with the parking, where are we supposed to park? What are we supposed to do, right? And it kind of fits into the conversation. So those are kind of the things that I definitely want on everyone's mind as we move forward with this, and then making sure that we are taking into account the folks that necessarily don't shop online, right? The folks that are used to coming and paying their water bill in person. So making sure that we're also, as we're doing these surveys, as we're reaching out to the community, that we're also making sure that we're reaching out to that community that may not have technology necessarily accessible to them, whether if it's a financial issue or simply because they don't know how to use it. Just to make sure that we are getting as much feedback as we can from the community.
Thank you. Commissioner Fonseca?
Yes, so two things. I think for me, coming from my students telling me that everything that they do is now visual. When you're driving down 111 and you look at those parking lots, they're not visually appealing to even drive in there and to even figure out what's there. So that's another thing to really take into consideration. Again, going back to the question about, is this privately or publicly owned? Where are the revitalization plans to, if you look at the, I'm dating myself, I remember that when they built that shopping center, that indoor swap meet, it was the cruising, we all used to cruise right there, and I'm not gonna tell how old I am, but I used to cruise down there. But it was a shopping center, right? It was a place, and now it's very far from that, right? And so we're growing as a city and we're building new places, but that particular parking lot and then the parking lot across the street, and then even the parking lot where the Vons used to be at, and now Cardenas, I mean, it stays the same. So I think visually, I think now that we're becoming even more of a national, location with obviously the party scene and the festivals, that also is an economic development opportunity for us to have that type of vision. And then second, I think more importantly is how are we engaging, going back to the families that don't have that technology, right? We still have a lot of bandwidth challenges. Even I live in Tierra del Sol, and sometimes I have to take out my hotspot because my internet is not working. When my wife and I are on Zoom, it doesn't work. So I'm just thinking about, looking at those things that I know we want to go and probably go up, to the highest standards. But I think we also need to be patient that not everybody is there within our city, right? Some of us are ready for that next steps to put our foot forward, but we also need to be patient that there are people out there that we need to consider that are residents of our city.
Okay. Commissioner Murillo?
I have two things. We are a growing city, so for us, we are developing a lot of affordable housing, a lot of communities that are coming in. So that would mean people from out of the city are going to be coming in the city soon. So reducing parking spots, I don't think would be very convenient. I know it promotes carpooling and it promotes less waste. But how convenient would it be when we have people coming in from other cities living in Coachella, and we don't have enough to accommodate them going into a commercial place? Or I guess the new generations will be more online, but yet again, new generations look for home, like, local shops, like coffee shops, local restaurants. So if we're looking for something local, they're gonna wanna go and visit there. And reducing a parking spot, I don't think would be very convenient. If we would go to initiative 3, I also agree with Councilmember Figueroa and Councilmember Virgen. Stacked parking, I don't think it's very convenient for the city in general. I don't think it's very appealing to look at, and I think it would just take a wrong turn from being a growing city.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the right way to go.
Vice Chair Hernandez?
One thing. Want to take into consideration, if we reduce parking in existing commercial centers, it allows those specific centers and the ownership there to do lot splits, right? And then possibly sell off and, those lots to future developers, right? That there becomes the economic incentive, right? In those existing areas and draws more interest into those areas, right? Because a lot of those areas that we're talking about, that being underutilized, or the parking lots are underutilized because people are not really gravitating to those centers. And so maybe we can really look at specific districts and where we do this at, right? Like specifically the 2 entry that are at the entry of the city. I think they would probably best be in the best take advantage of it, right? So it would benefit them, right? So maybe that would bring some appeal, bring a draw to the city as they dive in, that we really see development occur. Also too, I do feel that we should really look at districts and really attack specific. It's not a parking solution for the whole city, right? Because every area is unique. And so I was making a comment and to the director here, you can really tell as far as you look at the center, you can tell which era the center and the community which year they were developed, just based upon the architectural and the flow, right, and the characteristics of the development. And so that's something to take into consideration.
Yeah, I agree. And you can think about the areas where they showed the indoor swap meet area, and we all have good memories there. But obviously if you look at where Cárdenas is at, and you have the complete opposite thing there, you don't have enough parking for the gym is there, and so the last 2 months I've been going to the gym now, so very proud of myself. But when I don't go in the mornings and I get to go in the afternoons after work, there's no parking, and I'm trying to park by the famous footwear area, and then it says there no gym parking, and then I have to park all the way by Cárdenas, and I'm taking Cárdenas spot. So obviously there's areas, there's districts where we could be a little more bold, like the downtown, maybe on areas 111. And part of it is there's a lot of vacancies. It's those businesses are a little older, they not attracting as many folks. So maybe you could be a little more bold, like now how Garibaldi is there in that corner. At one point it wasn't there and it was empty parking lot. Now you have Garibaldi in that corner and more spaces there, and in there those parking spots are utilized pretty well. So I concur with our Vice Chairman Hernandez on maybe we could look at areas where we could be bold, and other areas where maybe we aren't, as if we remove the amount of parking for a future gym, and we see the issue that's happening right now at Planet Fitness, and we might have more of that filling into other near buildings. But I know Councilmember Dr. Figueroa, yes.
I was just gonna concur with the districts, and the one thing that I would be okay with, doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, not 10, but not 10 on 3, adding 10 as number 4, in that kind of that plan. Because if you create those districts and you can come back and present, the outlay of, there's some parking lots are gonna, some areas are gonna need more parking, but also, we're looking at presentation from Stephanie and looking at the carpool and the air-friendly vehicles, but also doing, I think, making sure there's incentive programs for these new, building out, electric parking spots, and how do you, if you have this many, because those electric parking spots, and then they're metered, and in a lot of locations they're metered because after that they get added. So looking at that, and so how do we really look at that? But, you know, my question for you would be, you know, how do you look at what gets approved where, right? Because you've seen some of them, you know, it goes to 15% goes to the director and then 30% goes to the planning commission and city council. So, you know, what would be the standard and making sure that we make this a streamlined process? Because in one of them, it said, you know, it takes up to 3 months, right? And so that's a long time for a developer if they're trying to get something out. So, you know, what's equitable both for the developer and for the city, and how do you streamline that process? So that's something we really have to see. Because I think 3 months is a long time to wait for something. But bureaucracy does take that long sometimes in something. So that is my comment. That the districts, I think, you know, I don't know what your ideas are. For you.
Yeah.
But leave it up to staff to
Yeah.
bring forward some, you know, some proposed, you know, yeah, you know, Gabriel, it's not a one size fits all here. What is appealing for our downtown here is not going to be the same for the one for Grapefruit or for Cesar Chavez, you know, and so we could be, you know, we can be both. We've seen it on Jackson and Indio. I know Indio was an example, but now you have Dunkin' Donuts where you have a Verizon near Jackson, where all of that used to be parking, and so yeah, I think we could do some more of that and bring in more economic development opportunities to our city. I don't want to impede into everyone's evening. Any closing thoughts or ideas? I think you heard from there's a consensus where I think we could be bold. We're looking at 3 generally, but there's some areas where people can be a little more willing than other areas. Commissioner Gonzalez, do you have any?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the areas that
You missed that whole part of the meeting. Yeah.
You know, that's the problem because of the ADUs, and I think what we really need to do is actually identify at least the portion of the house in front of the area where the houses, the ADUs are being built, because I'm gonna just use an example. The people in front of me, they have 10 cars. So they're all over the block.
That's fine, yeah.
And that's an issue, not only in my neighborhood, but I think across the city.
Yeah.
So one of the things I was thinking is that we paint the curb a certain color to identify that there's an ADU in that spot needs to be respected. I mean, that's just something I'm throwing out there, but that's a potential problem across the city. So I think that
How would you suggest we go about doing it? Like, how do you?
Well, I
How do
think-
you buy the color? Tax them or?
well, I mean, people can, if they have an ADU and they're building an ADU, I think it probably go by we'll identify a certain color and then you paint the curb that certain color.
Yeah, but like, so just because they bought an ADU is, well, they construct an ADU, yes, but what merits the parking space for that ADU?
Well, I mean, that's, you're paying property taxes on that particular parcel. So I think that, you know, I think people identify that parking space to that property. My point is that, you know, everybody parks everywhere, and sometimes, you know,
Yeah.
you have an ADU or you have an extra parking there, you have to park across the whole block, and I mean,
Yeah.
so,
I agree with you.
Yeah.
It's like the thing that's kind of in trying to figure out here. If we designate a curbside parking for that unit. What merits that curbside parking for that unit, right? Obviously, yes, they are paying parking, they are paying property taxes, but should they now pay a parking tax to guarantee that parking space for that unit, right? So we gotta really think about something.
I don't like that idea. We're gonna have a party. I want my family members, they can park there and all of a sudden it's gonna be blocked.
yeah, no, I've seen it, and I've
No, yeah,
had a lot of comments from people in the community, you know, saying, hey, we
Yeah.
wanna do something, because, you know, we have people across the street parking over here on my property, and, you know, and have to park all across, you know, all the way across the block, and I mean, actually,
Yeah.
so I don't know what the solution is. It's just, you know, something I thought, you know,
Here we have
it would make sense, you know, but
Yeah, you have a tough job, Gabriel. We're looking at commercial and then housing and obviously, and then even within the commercial, you have different districts, but that is a merit of conversation that we can, discuss even further, leave it up to planning commission to, come up with some ideas, solutions and bring forth to the city council. Specifically, Chairman Gonzalez on the residential areas, how do we want to encourage more ADUs and allow those that already have ADUs to get permitted. And so you know, how does the car issue become a thing when they're taking over the parking? So all that, you know, I think a chairman and our director, you know, can discuss in the planning commission meeting and bring forth to city council. But yeah. I think-
So I have something to add. I agree with the districts, and then maybe within the districts also identify the different industries and zoning types, because that obviously is a huge difference between each, you know, type of industry and then zone. We do have, you know, like we said, we do have all these spaces that there's empty parking spaces. It's just, you know, it's really a waste. But then we have other areas like the downtown where there isn't enough parking. And that's something that's been a conversation for many, many years, is that we look for a site where we can allow some of that overflow parking and people can, you know, park there. And I remember in the past, we were thinking about across the street and that didn't work out. But, you know, at that time, we're talking about when the whole revitalization of Grapefruit Boulevard was going to happen and when that street light was going to come in, because obviously before it was too dangerous for anybody to cross. You know, maybe that's still an option. But for the housing, Commissioner Gonzalez, I agree with you. I had just mentioned prior that one of the main concerns that residents had is that, you know, there's all these code violations that they park on their lawn. And so if maybe we can go back and see what those code requirements are and make it a bit easier so that people can convert their lawn into a driveway. I know pouring like concrete and stuff like that is just way too much for them cost wise. So I think we can become a little creative and maybe what we can allow for additional parking on the site. And then also I had in the past, I had a thought of an option that for new housing developments, that maybe that developer allow a space for some of that overflow parking so that we don't have so many, you know, cars and vehicles parking on the street, is that they're, you know, also kind of a designated area or, you know, space. I know we have all these retention bases. Sometimes we have an empty lot there, you know, maybe allowing that to be a parking so that we don't have all these vehicles on the street. You know, this is some options, is being creative.
I think the issue with the parking on the bottom. It's an environmental issue.
No, us pouring some, like allowing something, not on the lawn, but to maybe be creative as to what else they can, you know, lay on there so the vehicle can park on top of that.
A lot of homes, sorry, like to jump in there, a lot of homes like going towards North Shore, what they have is that they'll usually do like a lining and then they do some sort of gravel, but the tiny gravel. So it doesn't hurt, like it doesn't pop a tire or anything. That's usually what you see a lot of people do. But again, it's looking at the codes and reflecting back on what's allowed. Are you allowed to park on your own property? Will you get a ticket for it, right? Will you get cited for it or not? But those are definitely conversations that we need to expand on and look at, because there's been a lot of complaints regarding where people could even park when the street sweepings are happening.
The current requirements say about hardscape, what's the percentage of hardscape allowed on a road?
Excuse me, my apologies. It is 6:05, so we have extended to the next meeting.
So 40% allowed in hardscape. So let's say we say 50%, right? So it's 40%. And you assume those ADU, it's an issue. That's already, so probably, you only have.
Oh.
Percentages, right? You probably have
And you,
30% for the last year.
So let's just bring that back and then review it, and then also districts, industries and zoning within
you
districts.
got it.
Okay, we got good feedback.
Commission to get to, there's some food in the back, did we, everyone but the mayor was here, and then, I think the city clerk might have to look at I don't know if anyone took note of the times of people arriving earlier, so maybe you have to look at the Zoom meeting, but, other than that, meetings adjourned at 6:05.
Thanks, Gabe.